Hey folks, and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. We're continuing our talk about ecology with community interactions. Community is defined as all of the populations in an area, and interactions among the populations lead to the emergent properties of that community. And there are lots of different interactions that can take place. So we're going to take a look at all of them and kind of get into them a little bit more. So competition is a minus-minus interaction. It harms both species. All organisms have a specific role that they play in the environment, and that includes their different interactions with various species. We call that their niche. However, competition is going to limit an organism's niche. So basically, organisms have what's known as a fundamental niche, which is the maximum possible niche. It's what they could be, what things they could eat, where they could live, what ecological processes they could be a part of. But then competition is going to limit their niche to a realized or actual niche. And that could be because there are other organisms that perform similar roles. So it might limit what their role in the environment is, and therefore it harms them. It reduces their numbers. It also harms the other organism by reducing the amount of resources that are available for them. Based off this, we have what is known as the competitive exclusion principle, which states that no two organisms can occupy the same niche within the same community at the same time. And basically the reason why is because one of them is going to be able to do it better than the other. One of them is going to be able to outcompete the other and take over that niche. And so that leads to is what is known as resource partitioning, where you get different species of animals or organisms that live in the same area occupying slightly different niches. So for example, with these lizards, you've got ones that live on the ground, ones that live a little bit up higher, some that live up in the tops of the trees. They're occupying different niches, they're occupying different spaces because of this competitive exclusion principle. We also have this idea of character displacement, which is that competing populations are more divergent in adaptive characteristics than non-competing populations of the same species. So if we were to have two organisms kind of living in the same area, they're very similar species, maybe very closely related, they're going to be more divergent in terms of their characteristics than if they were to be living apart from one another. They might have much more similar characteristics. And so if we take a look at these two species of birds, when they're living in different places, we can see that their beak sizes, their distribution overlaps. However, when they're living near one another, you can see that they have much different distributions of their beak depths, and that is probably the beginnings of a little bit more speciation that is occurring. All right, our second interaction is predation. Here's where the predator is going to be eating the prey. Definitely a plus-minus interaction. The predator is obviously getting its food, so it's getting benefited, whereas the prey is being eaten. And this drives a lot of different types of evolutions because there's many different adaptations, right? Animals either don't want to be eaten or they want to make sure that they are getting food, so that there's a lot of evolution that is being driven by this process. One of these adaptations is obviously coloration. And there are a couple different ways we talk about coloration. One is cryptic, and it can be where you're confusing the predator. So this is some sort of like camouflage. So for example, the canyon tree frog, it is using the cryptic coloration to help hide it so the predator cannot find it. You can also have aposematic, which is a warning to predators by advertising a threat. So for a lot of poison dart frogs, they have very bright coloration, which is a warning that, hey, I'm poisonous, you probably don't want to be eating me. A lot of different organisms use that kind of similar idea of very bright colors is generally indicating some sort of poison, which makes sense, right? If you're poisonous, you don't want to be hiding. You want to advertise the fact that, hey, I'm poisonous, and then animals are going to leave you alone. We can also have mimicry. This is where an organism is going to mimic another. The first one is Predation mimicry. This is where a harmless species is mimicking a harmful one. So, for example, the hawk moth larva looks very similar to a green parrot snake. So, therefore, a lot of other insects and things that might want to eat it are going to stay away. You can also have Malurian, which is where two harmful species mimic each other. And so basically that, helps to kind of reinforce the idea that, hey, this coloration is not good. You definitely want to be staying away from it. Finally, or the next one we've got is herbivory. Herbivores are going to eat parts of their producer, kind of similar to predator-prey, except it's not, obviously they're not running around. Again, it's a plus-minus interaction because the herbivore is clearly hurting the producer that is eating. Again, there's lots of evolution that's occurring because of the negative interaction. And pretty much anytime we see some sort of negative interaction, it's going to produce a lot of evolution because that is going to be, impacting what organisms are surviving and which alleles are being passed on to the next generation. So one of the things we see with a lot of plants is the evolution of trichomes, and trichomes are there because they help to prevent damage to the plants, damage to seed pods, things like that. The final interaction we've got is symbiosis. This is where two or more species are living in close contact with each other. And there are three major types of symbiosis. We've got mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. Mutualism is a plus plus, parasitism is plus minus, and commensalism is a plus nothing. And we'll talk about each of them. The mutualism is where both organisms are benefiting from their relationship with one another. Classic examples are ants and the acacia tree. The acacia tree provides habitat and food for the ants, while the ants are going to be helping to clear the base of the acacia tree, basically keeping all competing plants away from it, as well as providing defense against other insects that might want to eat the entirety of the acacia tree. You also have the sea anemone and the clownfish. The clownfish can live inside the stinging nettles of the sea anemone. It gets protection. It also helps to bring it some food. Then we have parasitism, which is a plus-minus interaction. One organism is benefited, the other one is harmed, generally not killed, although it can eventually lead to it dying. Some examples include a lot of different types of fungi, or there are different insects that will lay eggs inside. Insects that will lay their eggs inside of other insects. So, for example, this caterpillar has lots of fungi growing on it that were implanted into it. This is a crustacean, and this crustacean will eat the tongues of the fish, and then it will get a lot of the nutrients of the food that the fish is trying to bring in. Now, the fish obviously gets some food as well, so it's not completely harmed, but it certainly is harmed to some extent because it's lost its tongue. These are birds. These birds will lay their eggs inside the nest of another bird, and then the bird will raise its eggs. Once they hatch, it will be feeding all of them, so it'll be feeding not only its own offspring, but also the offspring of the parasite egg. Of the parasite bird. And so that's obviously a really viable reproductive strategy because now you don't have to spend all your energy and effort feeding your own kids. You can have some other organism do it for you. And then finally, commensalism. Commensalism is where one organism is benefited, the other isn't. So, for example, these birds like to hang out around the water buffalo. As the water buffalo are walking around, they stir up the grass, causing the insects to fly up, and then the birds eat the insects. Doesn't really harm or benefit the cows very much, or the water buffalo, right? Now, there's a lot of debate going on as to whether or not there actually is commensalism or not. No one, there's some gray area, some interpretation, and basically the debate is that we may not fully understand what the benefit is, right? Or this could be like an early evolutionary step in a mutualistic relationship. So maybe commensalism is kind of like a stepping stone along the way towards a mutualistic relationship. And then we've got facilitation. This is where species have positive effects on other species in the community without actually being in a symbiotic relationship. So, for example, you have the juncus plant, and the juncus plant is something that tends to increase the diversity of a salt marsh ecosystem. It's not necessarily that is living in a symbiotic relationship with that. It just helps to facilitate other species being able to do well and being able to survive. All right, now when we talk about communities, there's a couple different ways we can describe them. The first is the diversity, and the second is the trophic structure. So diversity is the number of different species that are present within the community. We'll talk about a couple different ways we can look at that. Then we've got the trophic structure. And trophic structure is a measurement of the amount of energy and how that energy is organized within a community and how it's kind of being passed on through the community. So diversity, more diverse communities are more tolerant of disturbances, which is a loss of a few species. We'll talk about disturbance in a little more detail later on. So having a more diverse community is generally considered to be better. Now, there are a couple different ways we can look at diversity. We can look at species richness, which is just the number of different species, or we can look at relative abundance, which is the proportion of each species of the total number of organisms. So in community 1 and community 2, each of them have equal species richness. They each have 4 different species of trees. However, community 1 would probably be considered to be more diverse because it has a more equal distribution of those different species of trees, whereas community 2 has an overabundance of species A and a much lower abundance of B, C, and D. And so therefore, if you had some sort of disturbance that occurred in community 2, you'd be much more likely to wipe out the entirety of one of those species, whereas in community 1, the disturbance most likely would not wipe out, all of them. And then we take a look at trophic structure. We can either talk about food chains or food webs. Food chains are just kind of the linear flow of energy and from the producer all the way up to through all of the different consumers. The food web shows the more complex interactions of the entirety of that community, starting again from the producers and then moving its way up to the consumers. Now, when we take a look at communities, we have these very important species that are called keystone species, and these have a inordinately large effect on the community structure. And loss of keystone species is usually pretty devastating. An example would be the pisaster starfish. This starfish is very important, and you can see that with the pisaster, what we find is that the number of species present tends to be pretty steady and in fact increases over time. However, without that specific starfish, you can see that the species numbers drops down and declines and is actually very, very low. And this can be for a variety of reasons. Maybe these keystone species provide a lot of food for higher level consumers. They can also be a species that are eating and getting rid of species that are harmful to a lot of the community. So, different ways that these can be keystone species. If we were to take a kind of a look back at the food web over here, a keystone species might be, maybe the birds, right? Because the birds are eating a lot of the copepods and the krill, so maybe they're helping to keep those populations in check. But it's kind of hard to know exactly what would be the keystone species unless we did some sort of study. Now, when we talk about trophic levels, we need to talk about limits. And there are limits on food chains. And the reason why is kind of debated. There's 2 different hypotheses. Number 1, only enough energy to support a certain number of trophic levels is found, and this is called the energetic hypothesis. Basically, you have a certain amount of energy that comes into the world, right? And each of these food chains is only going to have a certain amount of energy. All of the organisms at each of the different levels is going to use some of that energy in their everyday processes. So only about 10% of energy actually passes on to the next trophic level, meaning that by the time you get to the top of each food chain, there's really not that much energy left available. This is also why people talk about, eating lower on the food chain is better for the environment, or, better, there's more energy, what have you, because there is more energy, available at things like the producer level, things like that. We also have the dynamic stability hypothesis, which is that the longer a food chain is, the less stable it is. Essentially, if you have a pretty long food chain of 4 or 5 trophic levels, if one of those levels gets knocked out, then that's going to be much more tenuous for the rest of the organisms because they're not getting as much energy, again, as you go up each of the levels. Most likely, it's a combination of the 2 that actually are the reason why trophic levels are limited. Most places, most ecosystems can only support about 4 trophic levels. However, some places that are extremely productive can get up to 5, maybe even potentially 6, but in general, you're going to go about 4 or 5 trophic levels is kind of the limit. Food chain control, there's a couple different ways we can take a look at this. We can either think about it from a bottom-up or a top-down approach. The bottom-up model says that factors that control producers have ultimate influence on higher trophic levels. Essentially, right, your producers are the ones that are putting energy into the food chain. So whatever's controlling them is going to control, the overall food chain, food web system, because there's only going to be so much energy available. You also have the top-down model, which is that the actions of the predators control lower trophic levels. So your predators are going to be eating your kind of your middle trophic level, your primary consumers, things like that. That's obviously going to have an impact on the amount of food that's available, as well as the amount of producers that are still around. So again, it's a combination of the two of these models that is what we actually see in the real world. Now, when we talk about the diversity of communities, there are a couple different ways that we can affect the diversity. Number one is a disturbance. These are events that affect the community structure by removing organisms or changing resource availability. You can also have biogeographic factors. These are kind of a mix of biology and location. We'll take a look at a lot of those examples. So when we talk about disturbances, disturbances are not actually all bad. And what we actually find is that diversity is highest when communities experience intermediate levels of disturbance. So what that does is it helps to produce a little bit of competition, right? The organisms that are most likely to survive or the most fit are able to survive and thrive. Whereas those species that are not as well adapted are going to fall off and die. Now you don't want too much disturbance either, because then you're hurting your numbers of species overall, because you're just continuously removing them and making life too difficult. But it's kind of somewhere in the middle. Now, we as humans, we certainly have an impact on disturbances, and we produce a lot of disturbances. One example is trawling, which is where we go through and we have these big nets that we bring behind boats. And you can see here in a pre-trawling community what it was like. You see lots of different coral, lots of different fish. However, post-trawling, a lot less species are there that you can see. A lot of the coral reef has died. So, we as humans, we definitely impact the environment in a lot of different ways. Now, after some sort of disturbance, we're going to have what is called a succession, what is known as succession. And this is a sequential set of events that occur. And we go from what are known as pioneer organisms. They're kind of the ones that start off, and then they're building into a climax community. There are two different types, primary and secondary succession. So in primary succession, this is succession on previously uninhabited land. This would be something that doesn't happen terribly often, but it does happen, especially when we have ice ages, after an ice age. So in this example, we've got Glacier Bay, and what's happening is that the glacier is receding over time, and the times that it has most recently receded, that would be primary succession, right? It's uncovering land where things haven't been growing, and so it's uninhabited. And so it starts off with a lot of weeds, small plants that are able to reproduce quickly and able to get into the land, and they're going to start producing some good soil. Then we get into what is called the dryas stage. That is where you get some bushes, maybe some short trees, things like that. Eventually you get into some alders, some gymnosperms that are able to grow fairly quickly. And then eventually you get to the spruce stage where we get some angiosperms, some really tall, hardy trees. And so this is kind of the general trend that we see in both primary and secondary succession. So you go from these rather small plants that can reproduce quickly, reproduce rapidly, they can grow quickly so they get to the sunlight, and then eventually you get up to these much larger mature communities. So secondary succession works very similarly. It's just that it's succession that has occurred on previously inhabited land. So for example, this happens after fires, after a farm is abandoned, things like that. And so you can kind of see what's going on here. You've got only the corn plants from this farm. Eventually, you got wild grasses that kind of come in. You get some bushes eventually, and then finally you get some trees, some shrubs, all kinds of stuff like that. So this is the idea of succession. You wipe everything out and you kind of build things in. The small, fast-growing plants come in first, and eventually you get the bigger, slower-growing trees that fill in. Picture did not show up. That's okay. So biogeographic factors, there's three of them. We've got area effects, evapotranspiration, and island effects. Oh, there it is. The island effects, we have to go back to. All right, area effects. These are larger ecosystems, tend to have more species present, right? This makes sense. If you're a larger ecosystem, you've got more area, which means you have more diverse habitats, which means you have more species that are present. Just kind of makes sense. It's logical. Evapotranspiration, this one is a little bit more trickier to understand. Basically, what we're saying is that greater rates of evaporation and transpiration are associated with more species. Now, why is that? Well, if you have more evaporation and transpiration occurring, what do you probably have? You've got more water that is available in that environment. If you've got more water available in that environment, that means that you've got more water available for trees and other plants to grow, which means that therefore there's more food available for animal species. And so what we see is that if we have more evapotranspiration available, you get more trees and you get more vertebrates, more plant species, I'm sorry, more animal species that are present. And so this is, generally places that are warm and humid, right? Tend to have more evapotranspiration, which are places like the tropics, and we see a lot of diversity in the tropic areas. Finally, we have island effects. Islands are any isolated ecosystems. It doesn't necessarily have to just be an island. Like an island, like we tend to think about like Hawaii or something like that. It could also be, like a mountain would be considered an island because you're kind of isolated apart from other similar ecosystems. But basically, what we see is that islands have kind of these two interesting phenomenon. You've got immigration, right? So you have species that are coming in from other places. You've got extinction. There's kind of a place in the middle where you're eventually going to reach equilibrium, where your rate of immigration, your rate of extinction are going to equal out. You kind of enter into kind of a homeostasis, right, in equilibrium. Now, small islands are generally going to have less immigration because they are smaller and harder to find. They're also going to tend to have greater rates of extinction because there's more pressures put on those species. Larger islands tend to have lower rates of extinction because there's less pressure on the species that are there. They also have higher rates of immigration. So larger islands tend to have a larger number of species because of that. We also have islands that are closer to the mainland versus islands that are farther away. Islands that are closer to the mainland have increased rates of immigration, and they also have, a little bit lower rates of extinction because again they're nearer to to the mainland. There's a little bit more resource availability. Far islands tend to have increased or lower rates of immigration and higher rates of extinction because they're kind of more isolated. There's less resources available. So what we see is that islands that are large and close to other places tend to have much more number of species than islands that are small and farther away from the mainland. And that's all we've got to talk to you about today about communities. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.